the kind of change that I'd like to see over that time
Yeah,
is that
right.
we are doing, so when you asked for the kind of project examples and we talked about the wildcats, I said, well, that's not Mammal Society led. I would love us to be able to say, if we were to reconvene on this call in 10 years time, to say, it's this project over here, it's led by the Mammal Society and it's involved this impact on the landscape. So that's because at the moment what we do is we strengthen, we convene and we support, and I don't want us to stop doing any of that because we're a kind of force for good practice in mammalogy and conservation. But I do also want us to be able to push at those opportunities and address those undermet challenges ourselves, and actually be the kind of game changers. Because a lot of the time we can give the evidence for something being needed and we can call for it to be done, but ultimately we don't currently have the funding and the capacity and the infrastructure to go out and actually implement that and run it ourselves, and to know that it's being done as efficiently and with as much scientific rigor as we feel it should be done.
All right, thanks, Matt, for joining us again on The Light Side of Green. It's a pleasure to have you. I'm very excited to get into your work at the Mammal Society and your role as the CEO of the Mammal Society, to learn a bit about some of the challenges that you're overcoming, but also what your plans are for the future. But maybe before we get to that, I'd really love to dive into some of your background to really see if we can try and trace a thread from your past experiences to where you are today. And I thought we would start with your first experience that I can see on LinkedIn, which was at Photo Voice, as you were there for 9 years. So it was clearly an important part of your past experience. So welcome, and why don't we start with Photo Voice?
Thanks, Anton. Yeah, great to be here again. So Photo Voice was very formative for me. It was an unusual start to my career, given where I am now, leading a conservation organisation. It's in international development. It was a fairly small organisation that worked on a consultancy basis to help larger NGOs generally to connect with the communities that they were serving, in order to have them take an active role in projects and also to advocate for change and represent themselves in communications and campaigns. So it's community voice and participation in development. And the reason I stayed there for so long wasn't just that with a small organization, you have fantastic opportunities to try your hand at various different aspects of all areas of an organization, really, but project management, campaigning, communications, you get a chance to kind of be involved in all of that. But it was also the subject matter itself, working on a variety of projects, always with issue affected communities and always around this idea of allowing people to be heard and to express themselves and to explore the issues that affect them. But in some cases, we'd be working, with the victims or the survivors, I should say, of trafficking, young people and also women from sex trafficking. We worked with disabled communities in countries where there isn't much sort of inclusive work that's done to ensure that their rights are met and that they have the opportunities that they deserve. We worked with communities in very issue affected communities, affected by climate change, affected by natural disasters, and so on. So every project was different, and it was extremely. Just the time flew by because 1 month you'd be doing something in one context, and then you'd be applying your skills into a completely different context. So always exciting and always interesting.
And so then from Photo Voice, you then made a change into the Woodland Trust, where you spent 3 years. And initially my guess was that was actually quite a big change, but perhaps it wasn't in the end, given the context at Photo Voice.
Yeah, it was a fairly big change. The change was fueled somewhat by wanting to calm down a bit. Working at Photo Voice, I'd have several projects on the go, and they were all around the world, including the UK, but they were often international ones. So there was a lot of travel. It wasn't great for kind of trying to settle down to a family life. And it was always very all-consuming, because you really wanted to do right by the communities that you were serving, and also multiple projects meant multiple challenges, and things would come up. So part of it was wanting to focus more on one thing, and to be more UK focused. But I already had in mind that I wanted to move towards conservation and the environment as my real focus for my career. And not having gone and done a life science degree at university, not being a scientist, I couldn't necessarily just go through the standard routes of looking at jobs in ecology, and some of the other kind of exciting nature-based careers. But I did have the skills in community building, communication, campaigning, and finding those ways to connect with people. And including young people. I've always had a sort of thread of educational work throughout my career, and that was what the that's what the Woodland Trust needed at the time, for a project that was very different for anything they'd done before, which was to try and bring public but also industry sector support around the idea of a charter for trees, woods, and people that really kind of brought to life the role that trees play in our lives and landscapes, and brought all the different agendas around trees together, around some common objectives, which was to increase tree cover, ensure better protection for the most valuable trees and woods. And so they didn't necessarily need the science side. They had the science. They knew what they wanted. They knew that there were plenty of people who could inform the communications, and could kind of make sure that what's going out is accurate. But they did need people to actually listen and to get involved, and to find ways to kind of make that resonate with different audiences.
Right, and so you can see the beginnings of a theme here. You've got this, communicating with community, building groups of, aligning groups of people around similar ideas. And so from the Woodland Trust, you then went to WWF UK, where again you got into education, and I believe that led into the Sustainable Futures program. Could you speak just a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So as well as the work that was associated with young people in schools, as part of the Tree Charter project at the Woodland Trust, I've also been the chair of trustees for an educational charity for over 20 years now, which works with some schools in Nepal. So education's always been a passion for me, and the role of education in actually bringing about some of the really big social change that we know we need in environmental areas, but also human rights areas. So that was the hook in then into WWF, where I started off on an international project, so working around the Netflix series Our Planet, and ensuring that there was a globally joined up education program, and resources that young people in schools around the world could use to really kind of unpick and explore the issues that the series touched on. And then I moved it again, a bit like with my previous career move. I sort of consolidated into a UK focused role as head of education at WWF UK. And that just allowed us to dive deep into, how we can actually enrich and in some ways steer the path of education in the UK to what it needs to be if we're looking towards a sustainable future. So the Sustainable Futures project that you mentioned was the culmination of a few years of development work, really. And the idea was to recognize this need for the environment, the planet, nature, to be a part of everyone's lives, and that doesn't mean that it has to be the one thing that you do. You don't have to go into the jobs that are sometimes described as green jobs. You don't have to go into conservation. You don't have to go into renewable energy if you're looking at the climate side of things, in order to be a force for good as opposed to a sort of force for bad, for want of a better word. So So the idea was really with that we would help young people at that kind of stage when they're considering their options for their future career. We'd introduce them to all those principles of sustainability and then show how they apply to the decisions you make around your career pathway, without it being a restriction on actually the area that you move into or the skills that you do use. So you can still play to your strengths, you can still pursue your interests, but if you want to be a web designer, if you want to be a lawyer, if you want to be a scientist, then yes, there are in all of those cases routes that you can take that will allow you to be a sustainable actor, and someone who actually knows that you're not having a negative impact on the planet. And it also had a huge opportunity because one of the issues that you face when you're looking at environmental education in the UK, that we don't have an environmental education curriculum. And so there isn't this kind of nice, easy way that you can enhance what young people are going to be experiencing at school. You have to find ways for schools to be able to bring in those topics and those skills, either through other curriculum subjects or into areas like citizenship, or in this case, careers guidance. And careers guidance seemed like the perfect place from my perspective, because thinking about my own career path that I wanted to take into the environment and conservation, but I didn't start there. I knew that actually this is something which can really help people to see how it's relevant to them and how they can actually play a positive role.
So I find that idea really compelling. Could you just give us maybe a little bit of an example of how, for instance, a web designer could practice or do things that were good for sustainability, and a lot along the lines with the Sustainable Futures program?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the one sense, so the way that we try to frame it for young people at the top level is that there's kind of three ways to think about this, or there's three routes that you can take. One way is to really go and use your skills specifically in pursuit of environmental restoration. So that would mean that you are looking at careers in conservation, you are looking at some of those life science degrees. Now that still doesn't mean that you need to have science skills, because you can go into conservation and support an organization, in communications, in PR, in ambassador management, and all these different areas. But that would be where you decided you wanted to take yourself and your skills and make it the kind of cause that you're working towards. So that's one route. And there's a middle route, which is that you would look at the company that you work for, or that you start if you were an entrepreneur looking to pursue a new idea that you've had and you think that there's a role for it. And that would just be thinking about the way that any business, no matter what they're aiming to achieve, has a footprint on the planet. And if you can be sure that the way that you're doing what you're doing is, where possible, doing good, but certainly not doing bad, then you can feel, really confident that, you can feel comfortable with what you're doing. If you're someone who's sensitive to the issues that we face, but not necessarily so impassioned that it's the one thing you want to devote your life to, then this is the way that you can kind of feel comfortable with what you're doing. And then the third route is to actually, maybe you find yourself in an organization or a sector that isn't like that, but you can actually be a force for change within that sector. And so, we weren't trying to use the Sustainable Futures program to create activists, because there's loads of opportunities and incentive and influencers and so on that are out there, particularly in that younger generation, who are showing what you can do as an individual activist. But there's less that's kind of visible and on show about what people can just do that's constructive, that is kind of steering things rather than objecting to what's wrong, and actually sort of bringing about change from the inside. So any of those three routes were seen to be kind of really constructive ways that young people could be happy with what they're doing, but also do good.
Yeah, no, I think it's really compelling. And you can see in your background, you're a very good example of exactly the diversity of skills that are needed in the sector. a lot of your work is based around community and communications and managing and building alliances, um, all towards restoration and conservation. Which a lot of people, when they think of restoration and conservation, think you need to be a scientist, you've got to be out there, test tubes and measuring things and that kind of thing. And so it's a nice idea to really broaden people's understanding of what the needs are and how they can use their skills and future skills towards a sustainable future. So I think that's really exciting. And so from WWF, you then moved into the role of CEO of the Mammal Society. So that's you've been in that role now for 1 year. And so how was that? How did you make that move, and what were you looking for when you made that move? And then maybe we'll jump into a little bit about the Mammal Society.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess there were a few motivators. I mean, one was to try and get, I guess, the best of all possible worlds from the experiences I'd had over my career. So I loved the experience at Photo Voice of working in a small organization that was agile, and where my role in a small team meant that I could, pursue my own ideas, even though I was, in the middle of the organization at that point in my career. But I could come up with ideas, then I could see them through. I could get involved in all aspects of it and kind of play to my strengths where my strengths were there, and look for support where they weren't. Versus the experience in the Woodland Trust, and even more so at WWF, where you feel like a cog in a much larger machine, where you kind of, that your remit is to fulfill your role so that all the other roles can also be fulfilled. And that's important, and it's why these large organizations have such impact, but it's also not necessarily as satisfying if you've got that kind of energy, particularly if you're cause driven, as we all are in this sector, to really want to kind of be able to jump on something when you see it. You weren't thinking about it before, the organization's not thinking about it, but you see an opportunity and you just think everything's so fast moving, everything's so urgent. If I see an opportunity, or if I see a challenge and a solution to that challenge, I want to be able to quickly deprioritize something else, reprioritize, and work on that. And you just can't do that in a large organization when you're working within a hierarchy. So working for a small organization, and of course being CEO means I'm sort of able to bring that thinking, bring that way of working to the organization as well. Just allowed that responsive kind of approach, and that kind of ability to kind of be at the listen to what's going on and be at the touch point, and then respond to that, while also, as I mentioned, kind of my real passion being supporting conservation and anything that's around the protection and restoration of nature, because I don't think there's anything more important at the moment.
No, fantastic. And so you mentioned a small organization, and I would imagine several people might actually be surprised that the Mammal Society is a small organization, because mammals hold such a grasp on our imagination. And so can you just tell us a little bit about the Mammal Society, what your mandate is, what you guys are focusing on, and how maybe you're structured?
Absolutely. And we have, it's a long established organization. This is our 70th year in 2024. So it was established in 1954. And we have a lot of influence. There's a lot of Mammal Society logo on some of the key guidance and documents around mammalogy. And so that has never gone away. The influence has always been there. But if you look back to the roots of the Mammal Society, it started off as a number of professional scientists, zoologists, ecologists, very prominent in their fields. Some of them in academia, some of them in management, coming together and saying, we need some energy here around mammal conservation. We need some kind of unifying hub, if you like. We need something to convene around. But no one was paid for this by the society for some time. It was it was a society in the literal sense. It was a community. And And then, down the line, when it started to have more and more kind of formal activities, events, annual conference, publications that were, reviewed and republished and reeditioned over and over again, it obviously became necessary for there to be a staff team. But the staff team has never been very big.
Right.
And in fact, I'm only the second full-time CEO that the organisation has had. So for a long time,
Wow.
it was very much steered by the council of trustees, who are unpaid volunteers, but they're like, the original founders of the Mammal Society. They are experts in their field, and they bring that sense of what the Mammal Society should and could be doing. But they need, something that keeps it as an effective organization and able to actually deliver on some of that agenda, which is why they need a staff team and a CEO. But there's another side to it as well. So on the one side, we kind of operate to deliver on a remit that's established and a strategy that's refined by this expert group that goes far beyond what the Mammal Society would have the budget to pay for. Is people who have that expertise, but they are in other organizations or they are their own ecology consultant. But then on the other side, we have our local networks. So we have our local groups, which I know we're going to talk about a bit more later. And that is a ever growing and sort of non-limited community of people who can get involved in our work, and we can act as a conduit to ensure that they are aware of, but also able to input to this vital conservation work that's happening, led by these experts and these academics. So we are a small team, but we are kind of representing two large communities at each level.
Yeah, and I'd love to get into talking about the small groups and your strategy for growth. But before we get into that, could you talk to us a little bit about the mammal issues that are sort of top of mind for the UK?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of an overview, mammals are, well, two things. One, mammals are some of the most sort of issue affected and threatened species in the UK and Great Britain and the British Isles. So 1 in 4 of our native terrestrial mammals, so mammals that are land-based, we're at risk of losing entirely, so becoming locally extinct from the British Isles. And that's extraordinary. That's 25% of those species. Right. And of course, when we see wildlife and nature generally talked about, it's often a mammal that's used as the poster child. It's a red squirrel, or it's a deer in a landscape. And there's of course good reasons for that. They're beautiful and charismatic. They're the animals that perhaps we are most likely to feel an affinity to. Foxes is another good example. Foxes are aesthetically beautiful, and so they're often depicted on things. And then you see them in popular culture all the time: children's TV characters, children's literature, fashion, jewelry, everything. So it's easy to kind of get this sense that mammals are not the ones with the problems. Mammals are all right, but what about these kinds of issues that need to be dealt with forests and lichens and things like that. But actually, people don't encounter mammals in their everyday lives. They're celebrated a lot, but they're not seen very much. And so people are used to just thinking mammals are just there, and they're something which is it's great to know they're out there, but I'm never going to see one. I'm not going to just see a wild boar as I walk down the road to the bus stop and so on. And so it's easy for them to be ignored, to be out of mind. And a lot of mammals are under-recorded because they are nocturnal. They're very elusive. They're good at evading predators, which means they're good at evading us. And they're not. So it's not like monitoring plants kind of habitat elements that are just going to stay there until you get there and record them, and they're not out at daytime like birds. So they are very tricky. And as a result, we have a lack of data. So we know enough to know that they're in trouble, but we have a lack of data to be able to inform conservation and to really know that what is needed is this is how we can do it, this is how we can avoid the issues when we do it, and this is how we can monitor success. So there is this key issue that needs addressing. that is kind of above and beyond any of the specific threats that they face. But the threats are very real as well. So landscape change across the British Isles has been a major issue for obviously a lot of different taxa, but mammals especially. They occupy these very important ecological niches in ecosystems, and a lot of the time they're, you know, some of the predators, some of the ones that are most endangered in our native mammals are the ones at the top. And so they're kind of the first to go when an ecosystem isn't functioning as effectively as it could, because there just isn't enough food for them. There isn't enough range for them to hunt. They need to cross too many roads these days because their hunting ranges or you know, need to find each other to mate is such that they need to travel across areas. So they are very affected by those kinds of issues. And then pollution in freshwater, and plastics in hedgerows and across the landscape are problems as well. And that's before we even get into marine mammals, but that's probably enough to give you a flavour.
Yeah, no, thank you. Okay, so I get an idea of the threats, and you can intuitively understand the issues that can cause for the mammals. Your issue of lack of data, I think, is really quite interesting. How do you address that kind of problem when your mammals, your subjects are so dispersed and so elusive?
So that's the kind of challenge that's really attracted me to this role, and one of the reasons why you know, it fits so well with where my career path has brought me is the key role of citizen science. So the fact that really, when it comes down to actually collecting the data that's needed, it's not about being a trained ecologist all the time and being able to go and do something really complicated and do things in a particularly you know, scientific way. It's just about doing something where you are and having enough people do that you've got enough eyes on the ground, you've got enough stuff going on across the landscapes of the British Isles that you're actually collecting enough data. So examples include trail cams, so getting more people to use trail cams and then submit the data that they discover. A lot of people use wildlife cameras in their gardens, but they just look at the footage and they might share it on social media, but they don't realize the huge value of submitting what they've recorded so that they can actually inform biodiversity data for scientists to use. And then there's footprint tunnels, which you don't even need any special kit for. You can just make one out of cardboard, and it's a fun activity for families to do, or someone who is a wildlife conservation volunteer. You know, it's something that's very achievable, and if they do it, they can find things that there's you know, there's few other ways to get the insight into the ecosystem than that, because you get the little creatures that you never actually see with your eyes coming in and leaving the signs. And we're trying to increase people's just general environmental literacy around what they see when they go out into a landscape. So the signs are all around us, but they are quite tricky to spot, and you need to have a keen eye, and then you need to understand what you're looking at. But anyone in theory can start to build that skill. So identifying different scats, so different droppings from mammals, tracks. There is a whole science to track identification, but there are some kind of clear ones that if people spot them and, you know, maybe take a picture for verification purposes, but it's the evidence that's needed. And then things like, you know, recognizing the signs of feeding or the signs of burrowing and tunneling and so on. So there are lots of things that people can do. A lot of them are quite fun to do. A lot of them involve getting out and spending some time in nature. A lot of them can be done with young people, either for the experience or actually because it's something which they can do just as well as an adult, and therefore can play a really, you know, valuable role in wildlife monitoring. But certainly schools can do it, you know, where there's teacher supervision, and you've got a school ground that otherwise is just an unmonitored landscape. So all of these opportunities are really exciting to me, and there's this huge untapped potential when it comes to citizen science that I think you know, can really draw a thread from the grassroots of people who are actually living in these landscapes up to the people who are, you know, coming up with the next conservation policies to try and protect a species that's on the brink of extinction.
Yeah, no, that's really exciting. I love the idea of citizen science, full stop. But I do think you do have one advantage in that your subjects, mammals, are so attractive to the public. Um, so this segues into a discussion about the local groups that you work with. So you talked about engaging with schools and the youth, but you also have a formal structure of local groups around the country, don't you? Can you talk to us a little bit about how you think about your local groups?
Absolutely. So we've got about 30 local groups now. The first
Right.
ones were founded in the 1990s. So some of them have been going since then, and then others have just started up in the last year or two. And the idea of them really is just that a group connects to us, so that we
Mm-hmm.
can give them the information, the guidance, and the opportunities that maximise their local efforts. And then likewise, we obviously ask that they come back to us with that insight in terms of what's going on in their local landscape. So we're trying to get a lot better than we have done in previous years at actually being the force that kind of stimulates local groups to start up and gives them the energy and the resource to be able to continue. Previously, because the Mammal Society didn't have much in the way of staff, it
Mm-hmm.
was more about just acting as a convener for groups, and they were very much out on their own, doing different things
Right.
and doing things in different ways. So we're trying to kind of bring more of a community feel and a community focus to the local groups network anyway, as well as trying to get more people to take part in their local groups or to start new ones. And we're recognizing increasingly the lack of diversity that naturally occurs with any kind of volunteer network that's to do with conservation. This is
Mm-hmm.
an issue that's with nature generally and access to nature, inclusion in conservation, and all sorts of other issues. But it's something that we feel there are ways that we can actively seek to address it. And we think it's important to address it because the issues around biodiversity loss affect everybody. And
Mm-hmm.
the conversations that are started at the local level when you get people working together on these kinds of surveys or on these kinds of projects are really, really valuable, and they can lead to great things. But of course, they're really limited if it's only one section of a community that's working on it. And then on the other side of it, there's the benefits that people feel when they do take part in these kinds of nature volunteering, and that's really important to me. It's not the Mammal Society's remit to look at health and mental health, but there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't recognise an opportunity to do good in that area and really try and make sure that the benefits of taking part in the activities that we ask our local groups to do are kind of experienced by as many different demographics across society as possible.
And so, can you help us to understand, like, exactly, or maybe give us an example of a local group, like how many people is in a local group, and maybe an example of the kinds of activities that they do, just so we get a sort of visual of what these local groups are doing.
Yeah, well, I'll give two examples because that'll show
Great.
the scope really. So
Yeah.
to
Cool.
give one very good example is our Cornwall Mammal Group, which has been going for many years. I think it's been going for about 20 years. And they've got a really good presence
Mm-hmm.
in Cornwall and in the surrounding area. And they have upwards of sort of 60 people that engage variously with the different activities, events, communications, and probably more that come along for this thing, and then maybe come along to something the next year. But kind
Right.
of a good community that's active there. And of course, as with these things, there's a core of
Yep.
people who are really active, maybe sort
Sure.
of 15, 20 people. But the kinds of things that they do is every year we have our harvest mouse survey, which is one of our under-recorded mammals. It's one of our
Mm-hmm.
smallest mammals as well. So it's one of those ones which, there's the danger that something could be affecting harvest mice populations, and we wouldn't know about it until it was too late and conservation couldn't do anything to save them. So
Right.
they go out in the autumn and winter to look not for the mice themselves, but for the nests that they've made in the summer and then used for breeding. And they're still there. So they're these balls of woven grass that you can find in long grass. And if you find them there, then you know that harvest mice are
Are
present
there?
in that area. And so that's a
Right.
nationwide thing. But in Cornwall, we've got amazing coverage of all of the potential harvest mice sites there, because they've got this great volunteer effort going on. And that
Right.
means that they're it's quite enjoyable. They look forward to it each year, quite rightly, and it gets them together and they go out there. And we've had students from local universities come along and sort of learn by getting involved. And we're looking at the possibilities of getting schools involved and so on. So the more people
Right.
take part, the more other opportunities arise. And then there's other local groups. So I'm just trying to think of a named example, but I'm not sure which one would be a good example to give. So, well, actually, no, I'll give my one. So we've got one up here in northwest Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have one here, and it was a real data gap. Obviously, the Highlands are huge, but they're very
Right.
unpopulated. So
Yeah.
data, some of the most important habitat in the UK, but some of the most
Yeah.
under-recorded. So it's a classic case of the need for more data. So obviously me moving up here when I got this job, because we don't have an office, we work fully remotely, so I could move up here, which is what I've always wanted to do. I was like, right, well, obviously I'm going to plug that gap. So we've started a local mammal group up here, but at the moment it's about 15 people that are on the mailing list and about 3 or 4 people that are really actively planning stuff. But that's because we've only been going for a short amount of time. But already we can start to take advantage of opportunities for engaging the community. So turning up
Right.
at events and running a stand that just kind of introduces the mammals you can expect to find locally. We can start to just encourage people who are already watching wildlife. They just aren't necessarily doing it with a scientific bent. We can
Mm-hmm.
encourage those sightings to be recorded, and we can also identify where issues are actually issues that could be addressed through projects. And whether it's us that do that, or whether it's something that we can look for help from an organisation that's set up to do that, then we can kind of take a case-by-case basis approach. So we've got, for example, mink. American mink is an invasive species that causes problems for our local species, and people do report them, or people spot them and share them without realizing
Mm-hmm.
they're a problem, and we can keep an eye on that, and we can make sure that the right thing is done where that occurs.
Okay, so that's a really good example. I'd love to double click on that a little bit, just to try to understand. So you arrive up in Scotland and you see that there's no local groups, and so how do you get started? What is it that you do to launch something like that?
So it's a bit like that old adage, if you do it, people will come.
Right.
So
Yeah.
a lot of it is putting the word out initially. So
Right.
we've got local newsletters. There's a nature enthusiasts Facebook group, which is
Right.
really diverse. People are on there because if you live up here, there's not a great amount to do. People are up here because of where they live, and
Yep. The
it's very
nature
unlikely you're up there
right.
without noticing nature and without being interested in some of what might be going on. So lots of people are members of that. They're not scientists, most of them.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of people aren't doing anything that would qualify as volunteering, but they are, sharing when they get a nice picture of a pine marten in their back garden.
Right.
So we've got places we can kind of just post, and places where we can kind of put this information out. And so very quickly, when I sort of raised the idea of a local mammal group, I put something in the local newsletter. A couple of people put their hands up and said, I'd be really interested in getting involved. And we just convened the call of those people. I think it was about 10 actually in the end. And some of them were involved in organizations that work around nature. And so it was good
Mm-hmm.
for them to kind of be in the loop. And others were just individuals with that enthusiasm. But as soon as we had that conversation going, we could start doing things. We could start saying, well, how about we do this? Oh yeah, I'll help out with that, and I can come along there. And then we're starting to tell the story of what we're doing. And so it's, in no time at all, we've got the capacity to be able to put a training on and get a survey, a water vole survey we're planning. And I know that as soon as something like that happens, there'll be plenty of other people that are kind of really excited by the prospect of doing that, and they'll come and get involved, but they wouldn't have necessarily known to initiate it or known how to initiate it themselves.
Yeah, no, exactly. Okay, and so you've got these 30 groups around the UK. I'm guessing the ultimate aim is to have coverage, right? So you're getting data from these small groups, but you're going to have holes in the data in areas where you don't have groups. So maybe sort of shifting the discussion to going forward, how do you think about growing your influence and getting more groups and more people involved? How do you think about that challenge?
Yeah, so we're looking at it in two ways that I think really complement each other. So we're looking at the coverage that you mentioned and also the diversity. And we're looking at some things which we feel will increase both at the same time. So one of them is to really, well, actually, the easiest thing that we're doing, or the most obvious thing we're doing, is getting a lot more guidance out there, a lot more information and advice on how you can start a group. So we've got a handbook now, which we haven't had before. So we 70th year of the Mammal Society, but this year we've launched a handbook for local groups, and that gives you some step-by-step guidance on what you need to do to get started, and ideas for what you might do, because you can take it in different directions, and that's already proving really useful. But sort of behind that is this idea that we really want to kind of diversify the idea of what a local group can be, so that people don't feel that if there isn't a local group, well, that's that, and then they might take part as an individual in our surveys, but they see it as being I'm not going to start an organization, I've got a full-time job, or I'm retired, or whatever. So we've shown that actually, if you can just form this kind of community, start convening people, as I've done, get people on a little mailing list or set up a Facebook group. That's kind of all you really need to do initially to connect into the network. And when you're connected into the network, a lot of the guidance and support comes. You don't need to kind of create these things yourselves. You're kind of being fed them. And that means that a school could register as a local mammal group. A university group of students could set it up as a student-led group that then brings in new members each year, and changes their offices and whatnot. Or you can have just a selection of people from across the community forming an unconstituted or a constituted group. So we're trying to make it really, really easy so that people can kind of find the model that works for them. And then the diversity side of things, we're recognizing that actually, if you have the status quo, as it were, which is that most nature volunteers are, white middle class, often over 40, over 50. That just is the way it is, and there's nothing wrong with the fact that all those people are getting involved. It's just it's a shame that others aren't. But it becomes a barrier in its own right to those other people feeling like it's for them, feeling like they're not going to stand out, feeling like it's going to be culturally appropriate for them. They might just think I'm going to make things more difficult because I've got dietary requirements or things to consider that people won't be aware of in this group. And so we're just trying to encourage people not only to make those groups inclusive, because that won't be enough. Like you can know that people will be welcome, but they still won't come because they don't necessarily know that that's going to be the case. So we're encouraging people to start up groups that are particularly for people who want to do things in a certain way, or want to know that it's going to be something which they feel comfortable doing. And then as soon as those multiple groups exist, they're in touch with each other, we're in touch with all of them, they can do things at the same time, they can be involved in the same projects. And so there's no limitation on what can be achieved. It just is allowing people to feel comfortable getting involved. So for an example would be, setting up a group in an area that's quite diverse. You might want to set up a group specifically for people from a visible minority ethnic community, so that they know that when they turn up, it's going to be some of the people, some of who they already know, but if they don't, people with this kind of shared experience, and that everything that happens is going to be appropriate and non-stressful and welcoming. And then, of course, when they're in and they're starting to do the same things as other groups might be doing, then, of course, that community starts to build up between the groups naturally. So that's kind of where we're headed. Make it as easy as possible and make it as welcoming as possible.
I can see that. In a former life, I spent a lot of time in marketing, and so I'm sort of thinking through your challenges from that perspective, and the handbook and the support is all about the how of setting up a group and how to better set up a group. But even there's a little question just before that, which is the sort of the why, right? Like, and so how do you get that message out to people who may have an interest in these kind of things, but may not even connect their interest with the idea of, oh, I should form a group, or I should do something to support the Mammal Society, or get connected and do it in a constructive way, because that I guess is kind of the first message and the first challenge, and you've got to get that out there at scale to then get those people into to then engage them in the how, I guess. Is that?
Yeah, no, quite right. So there's a few different ways that we're doing that. So one is that with our communications generally, we do actually have some fairly good followings on social media,
Right.
having been going for so long, and also talking, as you've said, about some of the most charismatic and well-loved wildlife. So a lot of the content we put out is quite kind of accessible. What we've tried to do a lot more than has maybe been done in the past is not just share facts and stats and lovely footage and photos of wildlife,
right,
but also to bring in alongside that content stories of the people behind mammal conservation from the perspective of who's actually doing those kind of key conservation projects, but also, you know, our local volunteers and you know, people who are volunteering for the Mammal Society, just so that people can start to see that there are roles, that there is, you know, this is something which interests them. It's not that, oh, it's nice to know that's happening over there. There's actually a way that they can support it. So that's definitely really important, and that definitely makes a big difference, because we start to get, you know, unprompted inquiries of, you know, do you need any volunteers and so on, and a lot of the time from people with qualifications as well. So in a lot of cases, it's people saying, what can I do? And it's going, oh, brilliant, there are these things you can do. And, you know, you didn't know that that was the case. But we also get more people who have, you know, ecology degrees, who want to do something that they know is, you know, really worthy, if you like, and you know, at the cutting edge of science conservation, whereas the career they're doing might be for a consultancy that's, you know, doing some fairly quite standard surveying work. So there's that side of things. And then the other two kind of more direct initiatives that we have. So one is not a new initiative, but we're again using it in a different way, is National Mammal Week. So that's always been a week. Well, I say always, I think the first one was in 1999. So it's a 25th National Mammal Week this year, and it was convened by the Mammal Society. And the idea behind it was always, you know, let's have a week where we, you know, take stock, maybe raise the profile of what's happening in mammalogy, maybe get some news coverage of those issues, and get people to just be a little bit more aware of mammals. But it was in October, which was a good time in terms of, you know, surveying seasons having been out the way, and ecologists being able to kind of start to bring out their findings from various surveys or research. But it wasn't so great for public engagement around nature, because it's not the time, apart from bats, which is starting to come out of hibernation, it's not the best time to go out and kind of see what's going on. And people, the nights are drawing in, and people are less kind of likely to be thinking about nature. So we've moved that to the spring. So it was last week in April. And that's enabled us to make the focus of National Mammal Week a lot more based on what people can do in their local area, in their own lives. So we had something called the Big Mammal Challenge for the first time this year. And the idea was people can just see very, very simple step-by-step guides. There's three options really for how you can get involved. One is to walk a mammal mile, which is to, you know, go out and just do a survey. We have an app that allows people to record mammals or the signs of mammals that they see along the way, and it gives you kind of tips on what you might see. So people could just go out and do that as a one-off. You know, they're not thinking, right, I'm becoming a conservation volunteer. It's because it's National Mammal Week, I'm going to take part in this thing. And then, of course, if they enjoy it, they know that it's something they can always do. Another way is making a footprint tunnel, which again is something that anyone can do just with old cardboard and whatnot. And then the third way is put out a trail cam, which of course we didn't want to make the only thing, because not everyone can afford a trail cam or has one, but it's a very good way to really get an insight. So that was you know, a really fun thing to launch this year, and the idea is that becomes an annual thing for National Mammal Week. And everything else we did in National Mammal Week was like I said about our social media channels, was just trying to uplift the people behind mammal conservation, as well as just the issues and the animals themselves. And then the third thing, so the other focused way that we're trying to do this is by launching an education program. So the Mammal Society hasn't worked specifically with schools before, and coming obviously from a head of education role at WWF, I was not only personally passionate, but also could really see the role that the Mammal Society can play. We kind of uniquely positioned to do something really great with schools, because you're bringing real science and that very just the really kind of valuable real science of mammal conservation, but you can make it accessible to schools in the same way that you can make it accessible to other local groups. And really tangibly, you can give schools a way not just to cover these issues and explore these topics, but actually to do something which for a lot of schools is really, makes a huge difference to whether or not they think it's valuable to put the staff time and the capacity in, but also it makes a big difference to the engagement of their students. If their students feel like, actually, the work we're doing isn't just going to be like at the end of it, right now you understand this topic, it's actually going to be going off and helping scientists and seen by other people outside the school community. So we've just launched that also in National Mammal Week, with a school mammal challenge, which was kind of based on the big mammal challenge. But the idea is that schools can do that at any time, and so as schools sign up, they can schedule in when they do their mammal surveying, dependent on when it suits them in their school year and their curriculum planning. And there's ways that we can support them, ways that we can equip them to make that really valuable for them.
I mean, that seems hugely exciting. In terms of, you could almost imagine almost every school is like a local group for you, or has the potential to be, and that could be a large volume of data that could come in.
Yeah, so the data is really important, and schools can be really interesting little snapshots of a landscape, because they, even in an urban environment which is quite built up, where it's not that there isn't wildlife still interacting in that ecosystem, but you do a survey in this location, you've just got this tiny little patch of verdure or a hedge, and then where do you do your next spot check? Whereas you've got a school ground is actually a larger area, even if it's not all green. And it's very, very quiet at night. So you've got all the nocturnal animals. They've got a haven really to traverse and to hunt and to forage and to meet up. So it's actually, it doesn't just give you that much landscape being monitored that wasn't being monitored before. It's actually an insight into a wider area that sometimes will be completely unrecorded. But you can kind of draw conclusions from what you find coming through the school at night, as to what's in the wider landscape as well. So that's that's great value for data, but also nice that the school can feel that they're really contributing something.
No, exactly. So we spend a lot of time talking about the data collection problem and the engagement around local groups, but a lot of your work also is around larger protection projects as well. And I was wondering if you could maybe just speak to maybe one of your highlight projects. I remember reading one about wildcats in the UK. I'm not sure if that's if that's off top of mind for you, but just to paint a picture of, at the sort of higher level of scientific involvement and influence, the kind of things you guys are working on there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so Saving Wildcats is a fantastic project. It's not a Mammal Society led project, and a lot of the time it isn't. A lot of the time we're sitting on working groups, we're bringing expertise in to inform coalition projects, but that one is very much led by a coalition, ZSL and sorry, not ZSL, the Zoological Society of Scotland, ZSS, and others. But we obviously stay in the loop. We try and contribute to public engagement and awareness, and we have council members on the steering group for that project and so on. So it's an example of one of those things that's really, really central to the kind of cutting edge of mammalogy in the UK right now. And we very much want that to be understood, as well as people being aware of it. So yeah, that's a really exciting one, and I think it's a really good example of some of the challenges that face mammal conservation,
Right.
because it's introducing a predator, not a predator
Right.
that people are intimidated by, like wolves, or in some cases, lynx. People are still a bit nervous of if you have livestock and pets and so on.
Right.
But still, it's something which feels like it's a little bit more spicy in terms of bringing it
Yeah.
into a landscape.
Absolutely. Sure.
But it also has all of these challenges associated with it in terms of the wide range that they need, which you don't have the same problem if you're bringing in a small mammal that will just live in quite a small area,
Right.
and all of the threats that it can face, and the fact that they're longer lived, they don't breed that quickly, and the kittens need nurturing. And so if one does get injured or killed by something that threatens them, that's a big blow. It's not like you're putting 500 out into a landscape
No,
at once.
exactly.
And, some of them
Right.
will go. But, so there's lots of challenges there, but most of the big challenges are around, first of all, maximizing its chances of success, which takes a huge amount of research into the habitat. So first of all, selecting the best habitat. In this case, it's the cairngorms, and then knowing enough about it that you can anticipate threats and address some of them. One of the big threats that faces, that has pretty much wiped out wildcats, is interbreeding with domestic cats, because there's just so many domestic cats, so many feral domestic cats,
Right.
that the genetic value of wildcat just diminished to the point of them not being a species in this country anymore. So you don't want to put new wildcats out there until you've worked out exactly how you can kind of minimize that. And then how to monitor them, because it's a big landscape, and small creatures that are very elusive. So they have these collars that can be GPS tagged, but you can't GPS track them just from your phone wherever you are. You need to go out into the field and get close enough with a
Right.
a
Tracker.
mast. So yeah, so it becomes all these things that people don't really think about. I think people are like with beaver reintroductions, for example, which are they're a little bit more straightforward in the sense that you can kind of anticipate their movements. You don't need a huge area. You just need an area that is appropriate and where you have sorted out all of the necessary permissions and dealt with any concerns from people whose land might be flooded and so on. But when you've got it, it's kind of contained. And people are just familiar with seeing mammal reintroductions as a one photo story. And it's the photo that's shared by the organization that's responsible and maybe put into the press of, somebody opening a gate and out comes the mammal into the landscape. And you kind of, for a lot of people, they won't think that there's much more to it than that. You get your mammal and you take it to a suitable habitat and you let it out. There we are, done. And of course, there's so much work that happens around that. And we think that it's part of our remit, the Mammal Society, through our comms, through our engagement with local groups, through the work we do with schools, to just increase people's understanding of all the other work that goes into it and why. Because that's how we'll get the support in a valuable way. We won't get people wondering why the hell things are taking so long, or why the hell it costs so much. But people can also see the roles that they could play within that if they're interested in a career in that area.
That's interesting, and I have seen. I like the way you describe that. They're often seen as like one-shot events. I have started to see the reintroduction of mammals in the context of rewilding, and that tends to have a more continuous story, because you're coming back and looking at not just that we reintroduce this animal, but now it is having an impact on the environment. And so the beaver is a perfect example of that. I'm wondering, are there some sort of top of mind success stories of mammal reintroductions? And maybe the beaver is one.
Yeah, the beaver is definitely one, and so far wildcats is very much so as well. It's early days, but the wildcats have been so the first tranche of several tranches of wildcats have been out there, and they're thriving. So that's really exciting. Obviously, monitoring will continue, but that's great. But yeah, beavers is longer established. So we still don't have any official wild beaver in England, whereas we do in Scotland, where reintroductions started. So in England, a lot of the places where you see beavers being reintroduced, it's in enclosures. So it's one step away from being kind of in a wildlife park, but they are establishing in the landscape. But it's a very contained trial, which is not possible with things like the wildcat, but with the with beavers it is. But yeah, the success in terms of the biodiversity increased in those environments is just through the roof, and that was what was predicted, and that's now been proven to happen. So there's this huge success story there, and there's a lot of people who just feel the evidence is now there that letting beavers out into the landscape just brings these benefits. And then there's the other ecosystem benefits, like floodplains that are created so that you're less likely to get these big deluges that just suddenly flood urban areas and things, because you've got more wetlands that absorb more rainfall and stop rivers from just being just stuck to their channel and then sending loads of water downstream. So you've got these various evidence bases for why they're beneficial, and therefore a bit of frustration that still we're in this treading water stage when beavers still have to just be in these licensed enclosures. Whereas in Scotland, of course, it's an easier environment. It's still not plain sailing, but it's easier in the basis that it's less populated and there's these larger areas. So new wetlands, don't necessarily take away from farmland so much or cause issues for others. And beavers, again, they're just, they're thriving. They can just sort themselves out to a certain extent after a while. And people get very excited about knowing there are beaver in their landscape. They're actually still really hard to spot. So although they're, you might know they're there and you might be able to see the signs of them, actually your chances of spotting a beaver remain quite slim. So it's not that people are able to suddenly go out and go, oh, look, there's a beaver. How exciting. They just know they're there, and that's exciting for them. And it'll certainly be the case for the wild. It's like very few people will ever see one of those wildcats in the wild, even when the population's firmly established and over a wider range.
But I guess with the beavers, the impact the beavers are having is so evident, right? And you can see the dam and you can see the way that they've eaten at the trees and how those have fallen down. Just those things are so delightful.
And of course, some disagree with that. So there's always this social side that needs addressing, and that's another thing which I think the Mammal Society has a role to play. And it's one of the areas that I'm excited as a non-scientist, as a communicator and an educator. It's one of the areas where I feel there's untapped potential, and it's one that I'm really exploring, because the social side of things, a lot of the time it's a particular stakeholder group. So of course it just takes participatory, respectful dialogue to get to a conclusion where you can actually get the outcome you want. So you don't want to release beaver and then have irate landowners who have lost their livelihood because their fields being swamped. All of that needs to be talked through, the potential risk, what will be done, what will happen if it does happen, and all of these things. And with wildcats, it's what will happen if you start losing chickens because the wildcats are hunting them, or grouse if you're a grouse farmer with a grouse moor. So all of these things need to be carefully addressed, but a lot of the time they're not that complicated to address. They need addressing, but it's more about all the chatter that happens around that. So a good example of that is not a reintroduction project, but a conservation success story, which is otters. So in the 1990s, our otter populations had plummeted and they were at risk of extinction in this country. And now they are, thriving again across nearly all counties. So there's waterways with otters on in nearly every county, possibly all counties in England. And that's amazing. That's really exciting, particularly as otters are, again, really charismatic. People love to know they're there, and if you do see them, that's fantastic. But also they are indicators of ecosystem health. So it's also a really good thing generally that they are there. But there are people who are affected by there being a healthy population of otters. They were hunted for a reason. They were hunted not just for their pelts, but because anglers and fish farms and chicken farms. They would take casualties on their stock from otters, and they thought, well, the cheapest, most cost-effective way to address that and to limit the impact on my profit is to kill otters, so there aren't otters making that impact. And so when they became a protected species, that's what really allowed them to start bouncing back, and that puts the onus on those stakeholders to get their livelihood in a way that allows for otters, that factors in otters. Either you accept some loss because you're not, you might get some predation, or you find ways to keep the otters from being able to do that doesn't harm them. Which for me seems like a much more sensible way around to do it, with that and with badgers in cattle farming and everything. So that's a big part of it, is just trying to get the rumors that are spread around potentially demonized mammals, especially. So wolves have obviously got this big kind of folklore association with evil, so it's not difficult to see why they're a challenge for people to embrace. But the fact that we have the same challenges with otters, and they're being blamed for, or beavers actually. So beavers is a good example. Beavers being blamed for for wrecking fish stocks and dragging fish out and eating them. They're herbivores. They don't eat fish. They definitely don't hunt them. So what's probably happened there is that rumors have been spread, and people have been willing to believe them because they'll share things that are negative about species they're worried about in other ways, and so on. So yeah, lots of that can be done to kind of enhance the nuanced public understanding, but also that kind of open dialogue around what people's issues actually are, and whether they're actually things that need addressing there or not.
Yeah, no, I can see the challenge there. So obviously, with a limited team or limited sort of home team, you need to be very effective or conscious of how you spend your time. And so, how do you think about the division of your time as an organization between the local groups and citizen science, and then these bigger projects? Is it sort of 50-50, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I'd say in the past it's probably been weighted towards the bigger projects. It's been weighted towards research and informing, those big conservation projects, and studying them, monitoring them, and so on. And then the local groups have been this kind of like bonus, if you like. I'd say now it's at least gone 50-50, and possibly more the other way, because I just see that our remit as a convener is just as important when it comes to convening at the grassroots as it is at convening at that kind of high professional level. So maybe 50-50 is the kind of balance we want to strike. And at the moment, because we're investing in kind of really regalvanizing, refreshing, and growing that local groups network, I think our efforts are kind of focused there as a staff team, certainly. We have, our annual conference, which is the kind of the conference. It's the moment for mammalogy research to have its kind of moment in the spotlight every year, and that brings both audiences together. But I'd say that there have been times in the past when it's very much just been, the academics and the conservation professionals and ecologists, and now we have them, but also those coming from communities where they are aware of what's happening, or aware of some of what's happening in their landscape, and they're interested to know how it will be affected in the years to come by what's going on in conservation and science, and what they might be able to bring to bear in their local volunteering. So that's ideal for me, is that melting pot that I really think we can enable.
Right. Yeah, no, I can see that. And so I'd like to ask a few questions about funding. I generally do when I speak to NGOs, because funding is such a challenge for NGOs, and is also a moving target, as well as the way we communicate with people changes, and the way we engage changes and evolves. And so, how do you think about funding for the Mammal Society, and then also, sort of looking forward, how do you think about the sustainability of the organization in terms of funding, given the uncertain times that we're in and facing?
So we've got I guess different income streams with different pros and cons. And I think
Right.
in terms of the sustainability of the organization, luckily we have two quite reliable income streams that are that keep the lights on, as it were. So that's our
Right.
membership. So
Right.
we are a membership body, and we try to give as much back as possible to our members in terms of information about our projects, but also what's going on in mammalogy, opportunities to really get tangibly involved, and to feel like being a member of the Mammal Society means something. So
Right.
there's that side of things, and our membership is growing rather than shrinking, as it is for some
Great.
organisations. So
Yeah,
that's good
absolutely.
news. We don't charge very much for membership, so it's not a massive income stream. But as I said, it's reliable. Like there'll be some that drop off, some that grow each year, and we
Sure.
kind of know that we'll get a certain amount of income that way. And then the other income stream that kind of, as I say, keeps the light switched on is earned income, which is from training and consultancy. So our training program has gone from strength to
Right.
strength. We've got a new training officer, or not that new anymore, but Fiona, who's done an amazing job of not just putting on a great training program, but making what's in that training program responsive to what people need and want.
Right.
And we are the Mammal Society, so if you are interested in training on mammal surveying or ecology or ID and so on, this is the place to come. And where there are other organisations doing great trainings that cross over, and quite rightly so, like the Bat Conservation Trust, the Beaver Trust, and we try and connect with them and support them, and sort of collaborate on trainings and events that way. So those are the two things which are kind of reliable and give us an income stream that we can depend on to a certain extent.
Yeah, sure.
So from a
So
sustainability,
just one
that keeps
question
us going.
sorry, just one question on the trainings. Who are the end users or the customers for the trainings?
So it's
Is it the
mixed.
local group?
Depends. Yeah. So we have. I mean, that's one of the things we've tried to work on, is try to cater for different audiences. So we have some kind
Right.
of beginner training for people who are nature enthusiasts and want to maybe just
Right.
understand better the landscape, and things like tracks and signs and mammal ID and so on. So people who are
Right.
kind of keen
Cool.
enthusiasts. But then we do have things like dormouse handling and bioacoustic
Right.
monitoring, which is the kind of training that ecological consultants would want to build up their
Right.
skills.
Okay.
In some cases, get a license to actually handle small mammals and things like that. So we do professional and enthusiast
Okay.
trainings.
I see.
So and increasingly we'll be working on offering a lot of free trainings for our local groups, but also finding ways that local groups might be able to bring in some funds to the Mammal Society, which is something which has not been done before. But we'd like to give more and more to mammal groups, and we'd be able to do that even more if there was also a kind of a bit of fundraising or some promotion of our activities that they could do alongside that. So they're kind of
interesting.
So there's opportunities for growth there, and it's definitely an area which delivers for us. But the game-changing amounts of money, the ones that would actually enable us to start a new program or launch a new
Right.
project or deliver a new publication, that's always much harder to come by. And
Right.
it takes, with a small team, we don't have a dedicated fundraiser, because when you've only got a team of 6 people, having one person, a full-time or even a part-time person whose job it is to bring in funds, the value of that fundraising officer is only going to be felt after they've covered their salary, because they're not there for any other purpose but to bring in money, and they have to bring in the money that pays for them before anything's a plus. So it becomes something you really need to know there was going to be a huge return on it. And we feel that that there's not the guarantee of that, and it would just put someone in quite a stressful position. So what we try and reach out and discover are those opportunities for trusts and grants who are able to offer funding for the cause that you work for. So they can give unrestricted funds because they support what you do, rather than that they will necessarily say, okay, show me the full project proposal, we will fund this proposal, now go away and do it. And that kind of work we do more in sort of consultancy frame. So there are already organizations and government bodies who have the remit to deliver impact on the landscape. we can actually do some of the work that's needed to enable that, and make sure it's done in the best way possible with, you know, all the scientific knowledge that can be brought to bear on it. But we don't need to find the money, because the money's already been found and it's just now being done by us.
Yeah, sure.
So that's the kind of area. Well, what I'd love to do is to be able to say, right, okay, our harvest mouse survey, we want to keep on doing it. We think it's really important, and we need this budget over this many years to actually do it, and have a funder step forward and give us the money that we need to do it. But it's a big amount of work to try and get a proposal like that together, with the possibility that you just won't get the response that you need. And in conservation sector, as you'll have heard from other people on this podcast, I'm sure, it's very difficult not to be funding driven. It's very difficult not to be able to look out and see where people are actually choosing to give the money and then go and do something in that area. And that's very frustrating if you want to do something over here, because like no one else is doing it and it's really important. But because no one else is doing it, there's no money there either. And so the most valuable thing is core funding that allows us the flexibility to decide where our efforts are best spent. And then every now and again, you get the perfect synergy, and you see that like something you want to do does fit with the criteria of a funding scheme, but that doesn't always happen. And you know, it's a case of trying to enable things like the Harvest Mouse Survey through our more sustainable funding routes, so that we can retain control over taking it in the right direction, because harvest mice are not an endangered species. And a lot of the money that's available, or even the money that used to be available from the EU, but especially now there's more limited options, it's kind of like, what IUCN threatened species are you addressing with this?
Exactly.
And if you go, well, I'm not, because I'd like this species not to become a threatened species, that's not good enough.
I can see the challenge, and I mean, already the fact that you have some base level of revenue that coming in that you're generating independently is really important. And a lot of the NGOs I work with, I'm working with them to try to get that covered, to get a base in there, so that their operational costs, at least in between the project spikes, you know, they've got that stability, which allows particularly smaller NGOs, allows them the ability to look forward, right, as opposed to just chasing the next project and getting losing focus. So I'm getting conscious of time. I was hoping to just maybe wrap up the bit about the Mammal Society by getting your thoughts on where are you hoping to take the Mammal Society in the next, say, in 10 years time? Where could you imagine you would be? And like, I guess, what's your sort of vision of where you'd ideally love to be in 10 years time? And what's maybe the biggest challenge in getting you there?
Yeah, so I think the real aim, the kind of change that I'd like to see over that time is that we are doing, so when you asked for the kind of project examples and we talked about the wildcats, and I said, well, that's not Mammal Society led. I would love us to be able to say, you know, if we were to reconvene on this call in 10 years time, to say, it's this project over here, it's led by the Mammal Society and it's involved this impact on the landscape. So that's because at the moment what we do is we strengthen and we convene and we support, and I don't want us to stop doing any of that, because we're a kind of force for good practice in mammalogy and conservation. But I do also want us to be able to push at those opportunities and address those under-met challenges ourselves, and actually be the kind of game changers. Because a lot of the time we can give the evidence for something being needed and we can call for it to be done, but ultimately we don't currently have, you know, the funding and the capacity and the infrastructure to go out and actually implement that and run it ourselves, and to know that it's being done as efficiently and with as much scientific rigor as we feel it should be done. So that would be my main one, and the barriers to that are just the ones we've talked about, really. You know, we're in this nice position of kind of knowing that we can keep the lights switched on, doing our kind of this core of what I feel is very valuable and worthy work. and therefore to be able to look for opportunities to find those project spikes, those spikes of funding that will enable a project. But we're not finding them very easily, and it would be great to find one big enough to really make one of those projects a reality. And obviously, the more capacity we have in that core, the more likely we'll be able to put the capacity in to work on a proposal, to push at all the doors that need to be pushed at, and then to get that project underway as quickly as possible. So, there are a few, without diving into some very interesting project ideas, because none of them are real at the moment. There are a few things which we feel it would be huge value in being done, and no one else is doing them at the moment. And at the moment, there isn't just a nice funding pot ready for those things, or we feel that there's a need for greater evidence to actually inform a solution to a problem that otherwise is just going to become worse and worse until it's one of those crisis points. And we would love to be the movers and shakers that prevent that.
And just at a high level, how do you feel about the state of the mammal health in the UK at this stage? Are you optimistic? I remember, I feel like I saw some data recently that showed that actually mammals are coming back in a significant way across the UK. I'm not sure where I read that. And I'm not sure if that's the case, but how do you feel about it generally?
No, unfortunately, it's not the case. But obviously, there are some really good reintroduction projects, as we've talked about. So where you've got evidence that it's possible, and you've got these kinds of excellent examples of where the work's been put in, and now those species are doing really well. The issue is that it's always with the underrepresented, the forgotten species. And there was a very interesting webinar in National Mammal Week with our ex-chair Fiona Matthews, who's an author and an ecologist, and she was talking about small mammals, which is basically a whole number of different species, some of them very different from each other, but it's those small mammals that you don't see that they're there. And she talked about what the fossil record tells us used to be their ecological niche. And there would be an area, a small area of landscape, and it would have literally hundreds of thousands of individual animals. The landscape would be alive with them. And that would not only be, an incredible source of food for the other creatures, birds of prey and larger mammals and so on that predate on them, but it also shaped the landscape. So it was incredibly important for the fertility of the landscape and the nutrition cycle and aeration of the soil and drainage and all these things. And so we've got various species now which we don't consider threatened, and so they're not really the ones that you see the stats about, things like shrews and voles and so on, because if you look for them in a landscape, the chances are you'll find them. They are there. We're not in danger of losing them entirely, and so they're not threatened. But they're not performing the ecological niche that they could be, and that would really make the big difference to the landscape and the climate. And so it's those kinds of things, and their populations are really, really far down on where they could and should be. And it's just because that doesn't take them into a danger of losing them altogether status, that it doesn't make the headlines and it doesn't become the conservation priority. Whereas, beavers were lost completely, we can bring them back. And that feels like a huge win. And it is a big win for the landscape. But there are so many other things that we need to address that are often not focused on, because they don't feel as, it might not be even that they don't feel as urgent. It's just, it doesn't feel as tangible to address them as bringing a big animal in that you can point to and say that's there now and it wasn't before. So, I guess we'd like to change mindsets around that, but also to start playing a tangible role in changing the picture there.
So there's work to go, but we are making some progress.
I'd like to think so.
Excellent. So just to wrap up then, I always ask everyone who joins the podcast, what advice would you give a young person who's looking to get into conservation, looking to get into doing something to save the world, but gets a little bit confused by all of the different NGOs that are out there, or isn't sure where to get started. What kind of advice would you give to someone young?
Yeah, well, I sort of encapsulated my real kind of golden advice in the Sustainable Futures program that I developed at WWF, and I do feel it's the most important thing is that you're true to yourself, that you're true to what you know you're good at, what you enjoy, and what's going to make you feel satisfied with the work that you do, and the life that you have as a result. And for some people, the priorities will be very different from someone else. In some cases, to do that, to get that right, you do need to be earning a certain, level of salary. And others, they're really just happy to wing it on a financial basis if they're doing something which excites them. There's not a right or wrong answer. You have to do the things most important to you. And then when you've made the decisions about what's important to you, then just see what opportunities match with that, because it's not a case of there's only one path or a few paths that you can take if you want to do good to the environment or to the planet. There are hundreds, and there are ones that don't exist yet that you can create. So the first important thing is knowing that what you're doing is right for you, and then find the path or make the path towards the sector that you most are interested in working in, because there's a lot more diversity in there than you might realize on the surface.
Yeah, no, I do 100% agree with that. I might even add to that, often people's first instinct is to, go from the global north and help those in the global south. But in fact, even in everyone's backyard, there are a lot of opportunities to do good, including working with the Mammal Society.
Absolutely.
Matt?
And then actually, since mentioning the Mammal Society, I'm not saying that we can have everyone come to us, but do look for those small organizations in your early career, because I really wouldn't look back with any regret on the years that I spent in small organizations, not earning as much as peers, but doing much more than them, that built up my skills much quicker and in a much more diverse way, to build my confidence. So I had much better experience of leadership and of multitasking and of ownership over projects at an early stage than I would have done otherwise. And so somebody who earns a bigger salary because they go into a big company or for a big, well-known brand in that early stage in their career, they might find that they've actually they've limited the amount of experience they can gain in those early roles. And that's not the case for all organizations. Some are very good at providing opportunities, training and secondments within the organization and so on for those career starters. But most of the time, there is a niche that needs to be filled, and that's the most important thing. Small organizations are a brilliant way to cut your teeth and build confidence and skills.
Exactly. Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about your experience and the Mammal Society. If people want to get in touch with you or with the Mammal Society, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, if you go to our website, mammalsociety.org.uk, and if you're interested in signing up as a member, that's absolutely fantastic. But you can just sign up to our mailing list and follow us on socials. You'll find us on Insta and X. Try not to call it Twitter.
Very good. Very good.
Facebook.
Excellent. And I'll put all the links in the comments below.
Fantastic.
Matt, again, thank you very much for taking the time. I look forward to following the progress of the Mammal Society.
Bye-bye. Pleasure. Thank you.